next question that's been voted up here. KD asks, what are your thoughts on big Canadian banks? Matt, I'm just going to stop it right here. I don't really know much about Canadian banks, so I'm going to go ahead and step out of this conversation and let you have it. But let me finish the question first. What are your thoughts on big Canadian banks? All offer high dividends and seem to have long run stable operations. How do they compare versus B of A or JP Morgan? And I guess technically, isn't TD Ameritrade in TD Bank? That's a Canadian operation.
Yeah, that's the one I was actually going to mention. But
so I do know that, but you take it away, Matt.
So Canadian banks definitely have a more stable history than American banks. Over the past 180 years, I know this stat because I've done research on TD before. Over the past 180 years, the U.S. has had 14 banking crises. The financial crisis of 08, 09 was just the latest one.
Mm-hmm.
We've had 14 different banking crises. You remember the savings and loan crisis back when I was an infant?
I remember the early 80s. I do remember that very well.
I was like 3, but
yeah, well, I wasn't.
The savings and loan crisis, going back to the early 1800s, there have been 14 of those. You know how many Canada's had? 2. And the last one was in 1839.
And they probably all apologized to each other for it too.
So Canada's latest banking crisis was over 170 years ago. So it's a much more stable history. They have much, I would almost go so far as to say it's a less greed-fueled bank culture.
Well, that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like.
So there hasn't been any needs for government bailouts of Canadian banks or anything like that. You do have the extra element of currency risk, which is important to mention because Canadian dollars and U.S. dollars are 2 different things. So I've been a TD shareholder. I'm currently not. I prefer TD Bank over any of the other major Canadian banks just because they have the U.S. exposure as well, and they're growing in the U.S. When other banks are getting rid of branches and getting rid of customer service and stuff like that, TD is doubling down on that. They have longer hours than most banks. They'll even let you bring your dog into a branch in most places if you didn't know that.
I like that. I like
so,
that. What about 2 dogs?
There you go.
3 dogs?
So, TD is my preference just because they have a ton of U.S. growth potential, and I love the corporate culture of the bank. But Canadian banks in general have just been much more stable than U.S. banks.